So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our regular Friday webinar. And I'm delighted to say we've got Hannah Vickers as our guest speaker today. I'll be introducing Hannah in a few moments, but we're just waiting for people to come in. We're expecting about 70 odd today, so it's a good house. What I'd like you to do, if you would, ladies and gents, in the chat box, just put your name, your organization, and where you're from geographically in the UK or even outside the UK. We like to know where you're from, the organizations you represent, and so on. It helps Hannah in terms of her presentation, and it helps us as well, so that we know who is actually joining us. So people coming in all the time. So we'll just give it a minute or so, and then we'll make a start. Let's see who we've got on the chat box already. Oh yes, they're coming in. Simon Maniton, APG Architecture in Bristol. Hello to you, Simon. Leanne Fletcher from Sir Robert McAlpine, North East England. Hi there to Greg Slater, Trevith Development in Cornwall. Victoria Beattie, Port of Tyne, South Shields. Linda from XBIM, based in rainy Durham. I'm sorry to hear that. It's actually sunny in Somerset, which is good news for me, because when I finish here, I'm off to watch the cricket. We're playing Hampshire tonight, so I hope the sun still remains shining throughout the afternoon. We've got Mark Wakeford, who's Vice Chair of CE Midlands and Joint MD of Stetnal, joining us from the Midlands. Harman Barrack from Henry Riley, LLP. Sam from PHP in County Durham. Jonathan Crosley, SRA Architects in Bath. Duncan Reed, Trimble in Leeds. So we've got a good mixture. They're all putting their names in today, Hannah. They must all want to meet you. Darren Warmford from the Esh Group in Durham. Good afternoon all, says Phil Ellis from Beaumont and Kirkland. Natasha Baum from Wilmot Dixon in Weybridge. And then someone said, sorry, Birmingham. Never mind. Hi, Lewis, quantity surveyor at RUA based in Norwich. So they're from all over the UK today, Hannah, which is great news. And then Tim Norton from Artelia UK in Luton. Okay, I think it's probably time we started. So a very good afternoon to you all, ladies and gentlemen. Most of you know me by now, but I'll introduce myself to those that don't. I'm Andrew Carpenter. I am Chief Executive of the Structural Timber Association, and I'm also Chief Executive of Constructing Excellence in the Southwest and in the Midlands. And in terms of hosting these webinars, I'm joined by the rest of my CE family from around the UK and also CIOB in the Southwest, and of course our good friends at Leaders Meets. As you know, we started these webinars back in March last year, and we've been running them every week since. We've got well over 4,000 regular viewers now, which is great news. Originally, obviously, we were dealing with COVID-19 topics, but we've now broadened that, and I'm delighted to say that today we're dealing with probably not only the construction industry's number one priority and issue, but the planet's. There is nothing bigger than the climate challenge, the crisis that we all face. So I'm delighted that Hannah's taken time out of a very busy diary to join us today. Hannah sits on the Construction Leadership Council and is actually heading up the co-ordinate Zero board, which I'm privileged to be a part of. In fact, I've just finished quite a hefty exercise. Thank you, Hannah, for that. I think we had about 2,500 results, didn't we, Hannah, from the consultancy? That was quite a challenge. Anyway, before Hannah speaks, I'm going to hand over to Howard from Leaders Meets. He's going to take you through the house rules for today and a little survey that we'd like to run. Over to you, Howard.
Thank you, Andrew. Good afternoon to everyone. Yeah, if for those of you regular viewers, you know about Slido. For those who are not, there's two ways you can get into Slido. One is to go to slido.com and then enter the hash and LM250621, which is today's date, or you can go to the QR reader. Most people try to do it on their phone, which means they can carry on watching whilst filling in. But today we're actually going to do the survey right at the beginning. So I'm going to put the questions up and we'll go through them slowly, and so that we can get an answer. I will then run through the answers to these with Hannah before we do the question, before she actually does her session. The questions today, as usual, please do use Slido to put in your questions in the Q&A box. And we will be using an exit poll, which we would appreciate if you could give us feedback on today. So let's have a look at the first question. So let's hope everyone, yeah, we've got 6 results beginning to come in. So people are doing the poll. So the first question, which of the following areas in your view contributes the most to the whole life carbon impact of construction? Where we build, what we build, or how we build? So you've got a choice there. 21 people are well ahead of the game here. So we'll move on to the next question if we can, please. Which of the following interventions from government is most important for our sector to reach net zero? Subsidizing retrofit, funding green skills development, investing in innovation within the sector. So if you could make your choice, 9 people have done it. For those of you who are still on question 1, don't worry, we'll give you a little bit of time to catch up. So Abraham, if we can have the last of the 3 questions, that'd be super. Where can your business best focus its efforts to reduce your carbon impact? Transport, buildings, a construction activity. Where can your business best focus its efforts to reduce your carbon impact? So we got up to 20 on that. So all in all, we've got nearly 30 people. For those of you who want to carry on completing the poll, you'll find as we go through the answers in a minute, it will update live as we go along. So I think what we'll now do, Abraham, is if we can go back to the questions themselves, and this will give Hannah some interesting information of the knowledge in the room. So which of the following areas, in your view, contributes the most to the whole life carbon impact of construction? How we build, 57%, what we build, 54%, and where we build, just 4%. So Hannah, is this a sort of the answer you would expect? Pretty typical. There's not a lot of difference between how and what we build.
Mm-hmm. So this is it's just interesting, this, because yeah, and I should caveat, there are no right or wrong answers to these questions. It's more just what we're learning from this. So I'm not at all surprised that we get the sort of how and what we build coming out really strongly. What's quite interesting is when you look at the 6th carbon budget, certainly in the short term, before we decarbonise the transport network, where we build is by far the biggest source of emissions. So thinking about how we connect our developments up to low carbon transport networks, for example, I know a lot of that isn't necessarily in our gift, depending on where we are working in the sector and how we engage with our clients and who our clients are even. But I think part of this, I said there's no only right or wrong answers to this, but part of what I'm trying to promote is the awareness that we get quite fixated on low carbon materials, on concrete's impact, whereas actually if you look at the figures behind it, transport and how we connect our developments up has a really significant impact in terms of the carbon that we can influence as a sector, not that we necessarily emit, but what we can influence. So it was just to put this one in because I thought that was an interesting point to kind of discuss through, and I'll cover it a little bit more in my slides, but interesting to see the results. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Abraham, let's have the second question up, please. Which of the following interventions from government is most important for our sector to reach net zero? 53% subsidizing retrofit, 37% on investing in innovation and funding green skills development. A bit more of a spread on this, Hannah.
Yeah, and this one was for me to test the appetite and the interest, if you like. So this is very live research. So the piece that Andrew referred to earlier on, we've just had a big consultation in the industry on this. So it's quite, I've now narrowed it down to the top 3 things, which are these 3. So what I'm working through now is refining what we think our ask to government should be as we move towards the comprehensive spending review in the autumn. So selfishly, this was a question a bit for me, but very interesting actually to see that retrofit has such strong support within the sector. Now, that's not to say that government wouldn't be investing in the others, but as the CLC, it's important for us to be listening to what the sector says in terms of where businesses want to be putting their money versus where they are really going to need a government intervention. So yeah, interesting to see that one. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Last one, please, Abraham. Where can your business best focus its efforts to reduce your carbon impact? Again, quite spread. Construction activity, 45%, buildings, 34%, and transport, 31%. So no right answers, but quite interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. No, quite interesting. And this was a bit of a one to get everybody in the audience thinking, to be honest. So this was a sort of lead into some of what I'm going to be talking about. But actually, I'm reasonably pleased that it's balanced, because my big nervousness was that we would have a lot of people focusing on construction activity, perhaps having less of an appreciation of the emissions of the buildings that they own and operate, and the transport that they use to conduct their business. So yeah, I think we're obviously quite a sophisticated audience, that we've got that reasonably balanced actually.
Great, Hannah. Well, thanks to everyone who's answered the poll. So I'm now going to hand back to Hannah, and please take us through your presentation. Just remind people, if you have any questions, could you please put them in the Q&A in Slido? It just helps us having to go to too many locations. So over to you, Hannah. Many thanks.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. So I have got a few slides, because I couldn't possibly do a Zoom without slides, but this is going to be a relatively informal, not too long presentation, in part because I think we'll have a lot of richness come out in the Q&A and the discussion. So if you like, what I'm going to do is give a bit of an overview of what we're doing with Construct Zero. It's a relatively new programme, so we have some bits that are more developed than others, but there's plenty of opportunities to get involved with this. There's plenty of opportunities, and I hope resources that will help you on your net zero journey. So that's the purpose of just showing you where we are. I said, just bear with me, because it's not all finished yet. We've only been working on this since the start of the year, so with volunteers such as Andrew putting in a lot of effort. So I do appreciate your efforts on that. Right, I'm just going to pop this up, she says. Okay, great. I will assume that you can all see that in the way you're supposed to be able to see it.
I haven't got it on my screen, so okay. It's not come up yet.
Let's have a go. I'll go again. Okay, we should go to...
It's sharing now, yeah. You might just want to put it into... That's it, great. Thanks very much, Hannah. Okay,
brilliant. Right, so I'll start off with a bit of an overview of why we felt we needed to start Construct Zero, because we really are not short of initiatives and ideas and projects to try and help the sector get to net zero. But as the Construction Leadership Council, you'll see Andy Mitchell is here on the slide. So as the Construction Leadership Council, we were looking across the plethora of things happening and seeing an awful lot of effort being put into helping the sector. But actually there was a real need to sort of consolidate this into a bit more of a coordinated change programme. So similar to perhaps to what we did during COVID, it's not that the CLC does a lot of stuff. The CLC is just quite good at convening and coordinating stuff and spotting gaps, because if we're not aware of everything that is going on in the sector and we're not looking at it in a holistic way, there will be some gaps, there will be some areas where we're going faster than others. So what we're seeking to do with this is to start to provide a bit of a framework to all of the activity that is happening within the sector, such that it makes it easier for businesses to understand where they can have the most impact, and actually to start to convene in a thematic way, particularly important where we have common supply chains. So if we think about low carbon materials, actually what we want is all of the SME builders talking to the major house builders, talking to the infrastructure clients, talking to the developers, and everybody agreeing to go in broadly the same direction, so that the market gets a chance to grow and establish and scale. And if we don't do that, and we all start trying to, specify or go at different rates with the types of products that we want, we will just end up stymieing our own progress. So really, Construct Zero is aiming to do that, to convene and drive change across the sector. The other thing we've been grappling with as a sector is being able to demonstrate through the CLC that we are doing enough, and we're doing that fast enough in order to be able to meet net zero. So you'll have seen Boris publish his 10-point plan last year now. Gosh, very confused with lockdown, what year it is. But anyway, relatively recently, Boris published his 10-point plan. We've had the 6th carbon budget, which gives us a really good data source for what the sector can influence and what we should be thinking about. And actually what we needed to do as the CLC was to sort of bash all of that together and say, look, what are the areas where we are going to be focusing on, we should focus our efforts for best effect, and how can we measure that we are progressing in a fast enough way in those areas. And in some cases we'll need intervention by the government, and in some cases we'll need intervention by the regulators, and in other cases we might need to think about investing in innovation. But actually, if we don't take a step back and look at the whole story, we're just not going to be able to make a very coherent case where we do need government intervention, for example, around something like retrofit. So that's really what we're looking for. Andy jokes with me that he says that if I invent something new through Construct Zero, then we have failed, because actually there's a lot of stuff happening. We just need to be coordinating it and trying to help businesses navigate it through the network of organisations like Constructing Excellence. So that's why I'm quite pleased to be here today. This is a part of what we're hoping to be able to do. So I'm going to move us on now just to talk a little bit more about how we sort of started out setting the direction for the sector. Now, there's probably a lot on here that's not a surprise to you. But what we didn't have at the start of the year was hand on heart saying, what are our priorities in an evidence-based way where we can have the most impact? We get very caught up with the technicalities of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and setting sort of bottom-up science-based targets, which is absolutely the right thing to be doing, but it doesn't help the sector say, is every business doing the thing that's the right thing for them to do? And does that add up to us as a collective getting to net zero? So these 9 priorities came out of some analysis of the 6th carbon budget. It's also got a slight overlay of where we've got government policy, because there is little point in us setting priorities that we don't have the stable policy environment to deliver on. Having said that, there are some in there which will still require government intervention. So it's a little bit of a hybrid. But really, what it does is it sets out the 9 areas where, as CLC, we think it's really important we are understanding what's happening, and we are trying to direct businesses that can have an impact against these 9 priorities to the one that, or the 2, or the, in some cases, if you're a big business, you may have multiple that make sense to you. But unless we provide some of that signalling to businesses around where to put your efforts, we will all end up going in different directions. So these 9 are the ones that we've settled on. They might evolve over time, but from our research to date, this is where we think we need to focus the efforts of the sector. Now, for us, it means we can use that to start to explain what we're doing as a sector. We can use that to start to think about, through these 9 priorities, where we do need government intervention. And actually, we can start to help businesses that are perhaps earlier in their journey to net zero to understand and engage with it in a really simple way, because, this is a sort of beginner's level, if you like. Which of these resonate with your business? Which of these has your business got a role in? And then behind that, we can build out the resources, the events, and the sort of government interventions that need to take place in order for that to actually happen. But the idea is this is something which can face into government, but also out to the sector, and help us just bring those 2 conversations and all that effort together. And you'll see here, we've started to pick these up in a thematic way. They don't speak to, because you're a house builder, this is what you need to do. They speak much more to, these are the things that need to happen. Think about where you are and which of these make sense. So, for example, a QS practice, we've got carbon measurement in there. That will really resonate with you in terms of what you're doing and how you're engaging with your clients. If you're a tier 1 contractor, you're probably going to be looking at modern methods of construction at the top, but you'll also be looking at things like zero emission vehicles and on-site plant, because you've probably got quite a big supply chain. You've probably got quite a big workforce that you commission and you work with. So how are you going to be using that directly in your business, but also out through those businesses that work with you? How do you bring that into how you plan and operate a site, for example? So that's the purpose of these, is to sort of give you a bit of a prompt and ask yourself some questions. And you'll see that from the questions that I posed at the start, we've got the 3 categories of transport, buildings and construction activity, which was, reassuring for me that you went relatively broadly spread across all of those. It gives me confidence we've landed on priorities that resonate well with our sector. So thank you for that, if only to make me feel slightly more like I'm on track. So just in terms of how we're going to use those 9 priorities in the programme. So we are going to use those to frame everything. We think they're quite an easy way for people to navigate. Now, the piece that Andrew alluded to earlier with his diligent efforts this week is around performance measurement. So what we've just concluded, and I will talk a little bit more about this later on, is behind those 9 priorities, what are the milestones and the metrics that we should be measuring at a sector level? And what does that tell us about what projects should be measuring? And what does that tell us about what businesses should be measuring? So we're looking to establish that. We're calling it the performance framework as a, if you like, a sort of balanced scorecard of whether or not the sector is doing enough fast enough. And that will all be framed through these 9 priorities. The second aspect is this, if you like, drawing together the programme of activity. So we can see that there is a lot of efforts going on across the industry, and by tagging, if you like, the efforts to those 9 priorities, it provides a really easy way for businesses to be able to navigate through to the bits they are particularly interested in. So what we've been able to do is to get a lot of that content, a lot of those tools, resources, guidance notes, even the relevant government policy, because it's coming out quite thick and fast, and tag that on to these 9 priorities so that you have a little bit of a hub for, if you're interested in zero emission vehicles, well, what's the sector doing on that? What are they, what's the government doing on that in terms of tax incentives? So you should be able to go to one place and find that. We're also going to build out in terms of our business champions. So as well as the sort of theoretical stuff around government policy and best practice guidance and different things, we're asking businesses to come forward as business champions and really give real life examples of what they're doing against the 9 priorities, so that you get these sort of businesses like mine case studies that, again, we tag on to the 9, so that hopefully you'll start to get some really practical examples in actually if someone else is doing it in the sector, that might be a really clear way for you to start picking up and taking similar actions, and what they've learned about that as well, because it doesn't always work. So we've got that sort of second aspect of signposting and support, which is all up at the moment on the CLC's website, and it's something we keep very live. The third strand is this: once we've got the first 2 and we're making progress, there's a big piece around us thinking about how we engage up into governments and into the regulators to explain what the sector's doing. That's really important for us reputation wise, but we can also use that to maybe nudge some of the clients. We can also use that to maybe start to move into thinking about some of the blockers to do with consumer engagements. So if we have a good, really clear narrative about what's going to happen with retrofit, we can start to feed out some of that into our engagement directly with individuals who buy from the construction sector. So that one's a bit of a slow burn. Needless to say, at the moment we are focusing a lot on COP26 and how we get the sector represented well there. But actually, I think over time that comes an engagement of what we're doing and what's changing and what our stakeholders around us need to be doing differently. We'll build out as we get our sort of story together. So I see that one developing a little bit more. So something I just wanted to show you is that our website is up. So a lot of that I've just referred to in terms of the signposting and the support will be up on our website now. So it's on the CLC website, so Construction Leadership Council. There is a big button on the homepage that says Construct Zero, and you can start to see what we're doing. We'll have all our news on there as the programme develops, but it will also have these resources. So you can see, as an example there, we've got under one of the buildings priorities, you can start to see what we've got out in that space. So again, you can pick up what's going on, and it allows you to kind of click through and find out in a bit more detail, but hopefully fast tracks a bit of that research as well. And you'll find the business stories on there. You'll find the government policy and the sort of sector resources. So there's quite a bit on there. Obviously, we're very keen to keep adding to this. So if there are things that you find particularly helpful in your business, then we're really happy to be adding different things onto there. This is really just meant to be a bit of a signposting website. So the more we can get on there of things that people find useful, and the more that we can share that learning across the sector, the better. And this is all open, there's no paywalls, there's nothing. So this is really just meant to be for the sector. Okay, I'm just going to spend a couple of minutes now on one of the bigger projects we've been working on. So whilst the website is up and out and we can keep adding to that, that was a sort of milestone for us in the first part of the year. What we're now moving on to is this piece we're calling the performance framework. And this is really, really hard, to be honest. So what we've got with the performance framework, we started off, maybe naively, you can probably laugh, and I'm sure those of you that, are running PMOs will laugh at this. So we started off wanting to define the sector level metrics. Now, very early on in that, we started to scope what they were and realised that actually those sector metrics are going to be a function of what businesses are doing and measuring and reporting, and what projects are doing and measuring and reporting. So what we've ended up with was something which started off as me thinking, oh, we'll probably have 10 sector level metrics. Maybe we'll have a couple for each priority, or maybe it'll be 18. We've actually now got something which is quite expansive, and which, bless him, Andrew has been part of the team leading the review of. So we published performance framework for consultation, which set out what, our first cut, if you like, of what we thought against the 9 priorities we'd gathered made sense for businesses and projects in the sector. And actually what we're doing now is working through all of that feedback from the industry, 2,500 comments, a lot of feedback from the industry around how we refine that. And ultimately what we're aiming for is this piece on the right, so that we can get to what are the really key metrics that we need to be able to demonstrate the sector is moving in the right direction. And I say that, I choose my words carefully there, because this is not a comprehensive everything the sector needs to do to get to net zero. This is what are the big hitting items that from a leadership position the CLC needs to focus on. And if we don't hit one of those because we are looking at a suite of 150 metrics, and we've got 149 of them, but actually the one of them is something like retrofit, which is so important, then we've sort of failed. So this isn't, this is not comprehensive, but it is important in terms of making the most impact for the sector. So once we've set those, which we are hoping to do later on in July, we'll then be using that to monitor our progress on a quarterly basis. We'll be using that to frame our conversations with government, because we will have a really good story about what we need to do, what we're actually doing, and what they need to do to enable us. So our negotiating position immediately becomes a lot stronger with the government, because we've got a much better story to tell, because it's comprehensive in the same way that government will be looking at policy interventions across the whole economy. We're sort of coming forward with our bit and saying, look, we understand our bit. This is what we need to do. This is what we need you to do. And it's really quite powerful when you make that sort of a case to government. And the other piece is just by defining those business and project commitments, we're not going to be stepping in and saying that's what you absolutely have to measure, but we're going to be pointing at it and saying, here are some things that maybe you want to think about measuring, because that in itself will start to bring consistency, and everybody's learning. And we're seeing, a lot, even, and this is regardless of the size of the business, to be honest, we've looked at the very largest businesses in the sector, and they're still learning. There's, there is a difference in approach across the tier ones. There's a difference in approach across the house builders. So what we're trying to do here is bring some consistency within those stakeholder groups, but actually across them as well. So again, we won't be sort of publishing and monitoring what the businesses and the projects are doing per se, but we will be maybe signposting and showing what it would make sense to be focusing on in terms of metrics. And I would see that as a bit of a sense check, a bit of a check and balance to make sure that if you have made plans, are they, how do they compare to that? Are there gaps? Are there things where you're going above and beyond that might give you some confidence that you're, sort of moving faster than the rest of the sector? So it's just a little bit of a check really. It's not meant to be prescriptive, other than the sector metrics, which we will be looking at reporting. So the pieces that I just wanted to draw out from this diagram, and you're not supposed to be able to read it, that was just it's a schematic, if you like, of the performance framework that has gone out for consultation. So what we have got on here, are the inputs to this. So the priorities themselves, I said, are based on the carbon budget. So there's some logic behind why we've got those 9 areas to think about measuring. And then what we did was, as a starter for 10, was map a lot of the, sorry, my dog's here in the background assisting me this morning. So hopefully he's not going to interrupt too much. So what we did to start with, before we paid this back to the industry, was map the existing metrics and milestones and commitments and things that people have already signed up to against those 9 priorities. Now, some of it was really good alignment, and I think we're going to, hopefully be able to adopt a lot of the existing stuff and recommend and signpost a lot of the existing stuff in the businesses and the project space. But there are also some gaps. And there are some areas where we just need to think a little bit harder about what we're going to measure and how we're going to measure it and who's going to measure it, actually, because some of these have pledges and commitments where there's clearly an organisation that's going to aggregate that data up. Others, it is far less clear. So that's an interesting exercise that we are concluding, shall we say. It's not finished yet. So we put that out for the industry consultation. What Andrew has been involved with has been filtering through the huge amount of responses that we got back, which is brilliant, because that's what we really wanted. We didn't want this to go out there and everybody, say it was perfect, because we knew it wasn't perfect. It was a first draft. So we've had loads of comments back, loads of engagement, loads of improvements. And what we're now working through is trying to refine those down so that we know as the CLC exactly what we want to measure going forward, and we can hopefully be in a position where we can issue guidance for the businesses and the projects about what they could consider measuring. And that's what we're aiming to get to. And it says ambitiously here, final performance framework by the end of June. I think what we've got now is a draft of that, and then we're coming back together with the programme board next week with Andrew and a number of different stakeholders. So we're taking it to the trade associations next week through the CRC task force, just to get the next iteration of that and get some feedback. But we are aiming to publish this around the 19th of July. If you want to see the draft version, that's still up on the CRC's website. We've not taken it down, but it's definitely something which is now sort of behind the scenes moving on and getting closer to being finalised. So we expect to see that out in July. And that gives us a good opportunity, as we say, to sort of almost set out our stall as a sector in July, knowing that we've got this comprehensive spending review coming up in the autumn. We can sort of say, look, our plans in place, government, there are these 2 or 3 areas where we're going to need you to step in. And that's what we're working through at the moment. So when we publish our performance framework, alongside that we will be publishing what does that mean in terms of regulators, in terms of clients, in terms of the government making an intervention, and even actually in terms of the areas for things like innovation, so we can start to steer some of that towards the areas that we think are best served in us meeting our net zero targets. Okay, so just wanted to show a couple of things now in terms of how you might get involved in this, what we've got coming up. So I've mentioned already what we've got going on in July. From September, we start to get a little bit more into business as usual in terms of the performance reporting. So if we've done a good job in July, by September, we should have something to start reporting in a quarterly basis for the sector. We'll also really pick up in earnest our COP26 plans. So, we will have sort of sorted ourselves out as a sector at that point and be able to start thinking about how we showcase that at COP26. So we're in discussions at the moment. We've done our expression of interest for the sector, for the CLC, and then through that, the sector to be represented at COP26. So we're working our way. It's a bit like X Factor. I think somebody described it the other day. We're at the judges' houses stage of COP26 now. So we're feeling quietly confident that we're going to be in the final when that comes to pass. But there's a little bit of horse trading. I'm going to build on the X Factor analogy of reforming groups and things, but it's a bit like that at the moment, to be honest, in the run up to COP26. It's who goes where, with whom, what's their event like. But that will play out, and we will know by September what we're going to be doing, and we'll be able to start to sort of garner the sector's support and use their networks like Constructing Excellence to really kind of bang the drum for the sector and get us a good run into COP26 and get us some good recognition. And then moving forwards from October, I said we'll start to see the spending review at that point, but we'll also start to see, hopefully, some policy interventions that we can work with, like the National Infrastructure Bank actually starting and actually having, it's got its scope defined, they're recruiting. We think it will be quite operational. So we'll be starting to pick up engagement with stakeholders like that by October time in order to be able to pick off those things that we know need to be put in place for us as a sector. So the last thing I wanted to just show you today was a little bit of, very specifically how you can get involved. So there is this performance framework that is due out in July. I hope that you find that a useful resource, and I hope that when we're coming to measuring the sector commitments and metrics, where we may need to lean on you for some support, that you will be willing, either in your business capacity or maybe through things like your trade associations or networks, things like Constructing Excellence, who I think will probably have a role for us in collecting up some of that data. So there's a piece there which I would hope I can count on your support with. Oh my God, I sound like a politician then. That was awful. Secondly, there's the signposting and the support. I've told you the website is up already, so please make use of that. Please help us and contribute to that, where you've got resources, where you've got things and even events actually that tag really well to the 9 priorities. We want to be putting that up there so we can start to broaden out people's learning. We can start to really help getting the sector better joined up in some of that space. And then secondly, the business champions there. So I've mentioned those a couple of times. We do a monthly call for business champions, so you can put yourselves forward or your business forward, provided you're comfortable with writing about what you're doing against those 9 priorities, and perhaps what you have planned in future as well, because what we're trying to get here is some really practical case studies. So we do those on a monthly basis, and I think there's absolutely a route through Andrew and the CE network to be putting yourselves forward for that. So just bear that in mind. We're not going to put a time limit on it. We'll just keep going and keep adding that content onto the website as and when it comes forward, but we do commission them on a monthly basis. I think the next commission may be coming out in the next few days, so that's quite good timing if you're feeling suddenly inspired off the back of this presentation, she says, hopefully. And then finally, the comms and engagement. I said there's going to be the COP26 events, but there'll also be the road up to that. So we'll be thinking about how can we work with the likes of Constructing Excellence to sort of plan out and plot out a campaign of events that gets us there. And likewise, we are going to be looking at, and what we are building up actually is some really good content around the 9 priorities. So we are going to be looking back out to the CLC network for organisations to start putting on events, to start thinking about, what can they do to promote what we've learnt around these 9 priorities. And it can be things like, we can get the business champions along to those events to speak and bring to life what they've been doing. But equally, if we've identified particular policy areas and you want government speakers, we can certainly lean on them as well to be coming out and getting engaged with the sector. I think the key is understanding which of the priorities and trying to go, if you like, a bit more thematic and a bit more deep in terms of what we're talking about at each of those events. But that's an open offer there, really, to think about how we might collaborate going forward. So I'm probably going to pause there. I feel like I've sat here and waved my hands around and I can't see any of you, so it's very strange presenting when you can't see anybody, but I think that's probably everything I wanted to share. But I'm very happy to take questions and just have a conversation about what I've said.
Thank you, Hannah, very much. Very interesting, of course, and I'm sure we will have questions from our audience. In fact, we've already got 2 or 3. So could we have them one at a time, Abraham, rather than all together? So Greg Slater asks, should the priorities more specifically mention reducing embodied carbon, assuming whole life carbon being considered? Funnily enough, that was a sort of question I asked early doors, wasn't it, Hannah, when I was first involved? So perhaps you'd explain to Greg what you explained to me.
Yeah, so I think, so we've got, maybe it's because it's not specifically mentioned as a term. I think what we've tried to do is to look at what needs to happen to reduce embodied carbon. So actually, if we pick one of our themes is around low carbon materials, if we're focusing on the development of that, the impact of that will be actually we will reduce embodied carbon. If we're focusing on carbon measurement, when we're, for example, preparing appraisals for clients and being able to show them the difference in terms of the embodied carbon and the operational carbon, then again, we will be, reducing that as a side effect. I think what we've tried to do with the 9 priorities is make them quite practical, knowing that actually we've got quite a complex it's quite a complex equation when you start to look at what does embodied carbon do versus operational carbon of the asset versus carbon, construction carbon, if you like, of how the asset is built. If it's off-site, and it's more productive, is that better? If it's on site and it's more productive, a zero diesel plant, is that better? I think there's we can get very tied up with specific terminology here. So if you like, it's not that we're not focusing on reducing embodied carbon, it's just that perhaps we've steered away from some of that language, because I think it makes it more accessible, particularly for those that are SME businesses in the majority of the sector who don't have an in-house sustainability expert, for example. So they would understand zero emission vehicles and plant, they would understand low carbon materials. They probably would take a bit of training, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. I mean, that's a philosophical question about whether they need to be learning about that, or whether they just need to be focusing their efforts in the right place.
Interestingly, Hannah, the group that I was chairing on the construction activity were of a view that in the main the building three priorities were pretty much operational, carbon, energy, and so on, and that the construction activity was pretty much embodied carbon. So I think I think when we come to next Wednesday, you might get some feedback on that. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, no, that's fine, and that's the reason for the consultation. So
now then, we have an anonymous question. Many southwest towns are expanding rapidly. Transport systems have not changed in 35 years. CO2 emissions, congestion is rising. Is this irresponsible sector development? The question is.
Ooh, that's a bold question. I think it's a fair question to ask, actually. And that was part of what was really stark to me when I looked at the 6 carbon budgets is, my God, so much of this is on transport and transport systems. And whilst, we have probably a minor role in that, I should say, as a sector, we do have a role in that. And we do have a role in thinking about what are we putting through, what are we proposing, and how connected is that? And actually, how much is that going to help us, in terms of enabling lower carbon transport systems? Are we putting charging points in our developments? Can anybody get anywhere by public transport from them? Are they connected to footpaths? I think, these sorts of things you would think warrant as much consideration for the developers when they come to their investment appraisal as, well, are we going to do this with low carbon materials? Because, this brilliant net zero house that actually everybody's got to drive to, and everybody's got to get their food shopping delivered to because it's in the middle of nowhere and nobody can walk or cycle or use public transport to get to work, is, potentially could be seen as irresponsible. So I think it's a fab question. And I look forward actually to seeing where we go with the planning reform.
I think, Hannah, from my perspective, having now been involved in some of the questions, I think the first thing is that we need to get the priorities in place and being measured. Because once I think these things are measured and the outcomes are known, I think that's going to change thinking, the way we go about planning and so on, because we will be able to measure the outcomes and they will be a known quantity. Whereas hitherto, I think it was just rhetoric. So I've always been brought up on the mantra that what's measured matters, and I wonder whether that will be the case. Anyway, now then, we have another question from my good friend Gordon Brown. You mentioned not being too tied up with carbon scopes 1, 2, and 3, but surely priorities 1 and 2 need an understanding of these to be able to actually measure and report.
Yes, so I think this is possibly a terminology thing. So now I'm going to caveat this by saying I am not a net zero person. So when I came into learning about this, I was finding the scope 1, 2, and 3 a real distraction, because within the sector, somebody's scope 3 is somebody else's scope 1 and 2. So you just, it's just really complicated to get your head around that as a concept when you're on one hand talking to maybe a tier 1 and then talking to somebody in their supply chain and then talking to the ultimate clients and actually trying to unpick and change the language to make sure that everybody understood what you meant by scope 1, 2, and 3 was just really quite difficult. So I think I don't disagree that we need to be focusing on that. I would challenge slightly to say, in some cases, the scope, now I've learned about it, the scope 3 emissions are by far larger. And therefore, if you're just focusing on your 1 and 2, or you're focusing on your 1 and 2 to get them to net zero, and then saying you're net zero and you're doing great, but actually you're enabling a huge amount of carbon emissions because you're not thinking about scope 3. And I'm thinking mainly here about, maybe as an example, designers. If you've got a load of great electric vehicles and you've got brilliant net zero offices, but actually that you're going out and designing coal-fired power stations, I think that is quite cynical. So we just, the reason I've kind of went with the thematic way was because I thought, again, terminology wise, it makes it easier as a breakthrough, but also you very quickly get to the point where you're like, oh, well, actually, that's not my thing, but that's a thing that I can influence. And actually that's probably bigger than me thinking about getting all my staff to cycle to work.
Trying to remember some of the responses I've been through in the last 7 to 10 days. I think there was one comment that said scopes 1 and 2 would be relatively easy, but 3 is difficult. I seem to recall that came through loud and clear in the responses. Let's go to the next question, Hannah, shall we? What changes to planning policy and regulations do you expect to be needed to reach zero carbon? There's a $64,000 question.
It is, yeah. So this is very much this is what I've been working on this morning. So I don't have a conclusive answer yet, but we will be putting that out in July. Early indications. So integrated planning, local development plans that integrate with the local and the national transport plans is hugely important. That sort of reflects a little bit of the conversations that we were having earlier on with one of the previous questions, but actually we need to think about where developments are and how they connect up to that. And we need to make sure that is a factor in the planning policy and what is applied, to those particular developments. A really interesting one that that's come out of the consultation was around the regulatory environment to do with getting power to site. So this is things you learn. This is why I like construction, because you're never short of something to learn because it's so big and different. But one of the things I think we're going to go and talk to the regulators around is seeing if we can get a bit of a change in the service level around how quickly power, mains power gets to site. Because you put that in at the start of the site, you're enabling a zero diesel construction site. If you're having to run diesel generators to charge the electric vehicles, you're not really doing anything any different. So there's things like that which I think are going to come out that will actually be really obvious, but just need a sector level. Okay, yeah, we actually need to go as a collective and have that conversation with the regulator, compared to some of the big legislative changes around planning policy. So those are a couple of examples, but it's still very much a work in progress.
Okay, thank you, Hannah. We've got a couple more questions in the system so far. If anyone else has a question, please do pop it into the Q&A on Slido, and then we can follow the two that we've already got with your questions. So I think this is Mark Wakeford. Does the CLC support carbon pricing to provide a complete framework to encourage all companies to decarbonise? Okay,
so I will caveat this by saying I will know the answer to this by the end of next week when we've taken the responses back to the CLC at large. What I think we'll be proposing to them, I don't know what they're going to decide, but what I think we're going to be proposing at the moment is there's quite a lot that I would like to, I think we are well on with, and that actually collective action, because we're such a big sector, can push. So, things like low carbon concrete, if we start to think about that and specify that and collectively move in that direction, I think we'll actually start to make some real impact. But this is part of what we need the performance framework for. So I think to start with, I don't think we would default to carbon pricing at this stage. I think would probably be something that we would kind of keep in reserve, see what happens with the performance framework. And actually, if there wasn't enough action fast enough, because it's quite a sort of stick measure rather than a carrot measure. So that's where I think we'll be. But there's a big but in that is the discussion for next week.
Okay, that's Wednesday, I think, isn't it? That's in my diary for Wednesday.
We have Wednesday.
Right, I think we have one more question. Don't forget, folks, if there are any more, get them in now. Then we can ask them of Hannah. So another anonymous one. At this stage of the journey, is it right to focus on measurements? Should we not focus on CR actions to take and bring measurements into the journey much later? There's an interesting one.
No, it is definitely interesting. So I think I agree in part with this, in that what we don't want to get fixated with is having metrics that are all back to carbon, if that makes sense. So we're doing these we end up with very long equations where you plug a lot of stuff in and that says your carbon is X. I think if our performance framework is those sorts of metrics, it actually, if you like, becomes a bit of a black box. And what we need to do is to start to learn about the things that are going to have the bigger impact. So what I'm hoping that we will land on with the performance framework are some, I'm calling them proxy actions, proxy metrics, but they are metrics which focus efforts in the right area. So things like, are we going to be able to measure that we're reducing business mileage year on year? And are we going to be asking businesses to commit to reducing business mileage year on year? So I think that's where we'll try and use the metrics to point businesses towards what the practical actions are. There will be some in there that will be sort of pure carbon metrics, but having looked at the efforts so far, we are not short of carbon calculators. There are many of them. And I sort of think we maybe need to, as you say, kind of divert some efforts, not away from that, but make sure that other more practical things have, a bit more of an action focus to them, rather than thinking if we invent 1,000,001 carbon calculators, we will have solved the problem, because that is clearly where a lot of the effort is going at the moment.
Certainly, having gone through some of the business champions papers, there's some really good stuff going on. Not just from the bigger companies. There was one company, I won't mention them, but a regional contractor who had a marvelous strategy for their business with measurements, which was really impressive. So it's probably not a one size fits all, I would imagine, is the case at this stage. Right, I think we've got one more question for the time being. So don't forget, if there are any more questions, please. Oh, they're coming in. No, we've got a few more now. So another anonymous one. You mentioned charging points in new home development. What should the sector be doing to ensure there is sufficient generated power to meet this need?
Okay, so in the same way as the CLC, we can aggregate up and to a certain extent deal with some of the sector challenges by getting different parts of the sector together. There are things like this which are just bigger than us. But what we can be doing is putting that back up to the government, negotiating with the government, getting them to say, look, there's 100% of stuff that needs to happen here. 80% of it we've got under control. We can do this because we're going to work together and we're going to sort this part of it out. That 20%, which will be things like, generation of renewable energy, making sure there's just enough electricity, the right split, in the energy we are using through the grid and how that's generated. That's for you, government. That's for you to deal with pass it back over and go and talk to the energy industry. So I think there will be things that are bigger than us, but as I kind of referred back to earlier, we'll have a really strong story to tell and say, look, these are the 5 you need to sort. We've got ourselves 25 actions over here. Thank you very much.
I do get the opinion, though, that government are listening. This is their number one priority. I think once we get through the coronavirus, this is without doubt the number one issue. I mean, we're just about to form a new timber industries all-party parliamentary group. And the MPs are really keen to get involved because they know the important part that timber is going to play in gender items. So I think we're pushing against an open door, Hannah, I would suggest.
Yeah, I mean, what they've gone, sorry.
No, carry on. I'm just going to whip through the questions because they're coming in now. And we've only got 5 minutes left. So let's go to the next question, Abraham, shall we? I live next door to 2 neighbours on a new development who have 7 vehicles between them. Should new development covenants restrict vehicle ownership and use?
Oh gosh,
there's another hot potato.
Exactly. So that's that is a social debate. So it's interesting. So I think, one of my roles, I sit on the board of a housing association, and whilst we don't restrict, I think there are certainly, maybe more from a social aspect at the moment rather than a net zero aspect, that you would be kind of having a conversation with somebody, but it just depends on how we want to approach this. I suspect, thinking about the philosophy of a Tory government, they're not going to be in the space of putting covenants on development. What they would be more likely to do will be, if they've got 7 vehicles, I very much doubt those 7 vehicles are electric vehicles. They'll probably start hiking the tax so that people don't have multiple vehicles. Actually, they try and think a little bit more about encouraging people onto public transport, and I suspect that will be a tax incentive. Incentive is the wrong word. A taxation intervention, shall we say? There might be something yet for your neighbour.
It's probably this one's a little bit outside the remit of what we're doing at the moment, I would suggest. But let's go to the next question. So Greg's back. To what extent do you think we can achieve low carbon steel and concrete? Now, there's an interesting one.
Yes. So, I have been having a good lesson in low carbon concrete. There is a lot that's been done already, as I've been taught. And there is a roadmap actually for getting to zero emission concrete, and that's a combination of what's in the materials themselves, how they're manufactured. So there is the industrial decarbonisation strategy actually, which relates to manufacture of everything, not just manufacture of our construction materials, but within that there is some really powerful stuff happening around government intervention, whether it's regulatory or whether it's putting money into trial sort of hydrogen networks into some of the manufacturers that produce the materials. So I think, add all of those up and it does start to get us close to net zero. So I think, that's what we need to sort of, if you like, be peeking under the bonnet of what the sector groups, and I know the Mineral Products Association are, doing a lot in this space. There was them that gave me the lesson actually on low carbon.
Was it?
Concrete.
Of course, I have to say with my timber frame hat on, you can always substitute timber where possible and remove embodied carbon completely. So, but I would have to say that, wouldn't I? Let's go to the next question. Have you come across carbon bills of quantities, and what do you feel about pushing for this?
Yes. So actually, again, just referring back to one of our business champions, they were talking about this. So they're a QS firm, and they were talking about being able to, they think, within 12 months, be able to issue that to clients alongside their, their bill of quantities, their program for the project. So I think absolutely it's the right thing for us to be looking at. We have got, stuff in there around designing out carbon and carbon measurement as a priority. And I suspect when we look down to the business commitments, it will be actually looking to the surveyors and those that have a role in this to be, doing that sort of thing, just to give the client choices. We can't make them, but we can help them make a better decision.
Certainly, when I was chair of BIM for Housing, one of the things that appealed to me, I was sold on the fact that with BIM we could actually measure the carbon as part of that process. I haven't actually seen it yet, but I live in hope. We've got one more question, which we'll come to again from Gordon, and that is: most charging points and EVS now can be set to charge at the best time for carbon between 12 and 4 a.m. Is that a statement, not a question then, is it? I think it is a statement. It's not a question, unless you want to comment on it, Hannah.
No, makes sense to me.
Okay. Well, look, it's a minute too, so probably I ought to say my thanks and get ready to let you all go back to lunch. But first of all, Hannah, thank you so much for joining us today, giving of your time and your knowledge. As I said right at the beginning, this is without doubt the #1 agenda item for all of us around the globe. And it's absolutely essential that we get it right within construction, because we're such big contributors to the carbon emissions. So power to your elbow, Hannah, and I'm delighted to be part of your team. So thank you for that. Now then, if you could go to slido.com, we have an exit survey which we'd like you to fill in, because that gives us details of what you like, what you don't like, what goes well, what didn't go so well, and so on. And we've also got, as you can see on the screen now, an ability to offer CPD certificates. So mypropass.co.uk, where you need to go, and the code for today is CE-695, CE-695, and you can download your MyProPass CPD certificate. Now then, I hope, Abraham, you've got next week's coming up for me. So many big issues going around at the moment, but next week we're looking at that of tackling the skills shortage. So we're going to be talking about that this time next week. Finally, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us. Thank you to my colleagues from Leaders Meets for hosting us. I wish you a very pleasant afternoon. As I said earlier, I hope the sun keeps shining in Somerset and we give Hampshire a real good thrashing tonight. Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye now.